we did lobo itu ao lobo de tip. We do we did three la da ba da lo lo de lobo lobo de do de little ubi you lu ace lo do 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 we look up we little do de do do
Hello, and welcome once again to the Jazz Musician's Voice. My name is Jonah Jonathan, and thanks for tuning in. Tonight I'm presenting an interview I conducted with jazz pianist, composer, and educator Andy Jaffe. Andy Jaffe has been a leader in the field of jazz pedagogy for well over 30 years. He has taught on the faculty of many colleges and universities, including Berklee School of Music, the Smith College, Amherst College, Williams College, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as well as Tufts University. Andy is currently the director of the jazz program at Williams College, and from 1999 until 2010, when the festival was discontinued, he was the artistic director of the Williamstown Jazz Festival. He is a frequent guest lecturer, artist, and conductor at universities and schools and colleges all around the world. Some of Andy's students over the years have included Branford Marsalis, Steve Vai, Marvin Smitty Smith, Stephan Crump, and Chris Lightcap, just to name a few. Andy is an excellent big band leader and arranger, and his 2004 album, An Imperfect Storm, was recently re-released, featuring his large ensemble compositions and arrangements. Andy has written numerous books and articles, including the college textbook standard Jazz Harmony, which is now in its 3rd edition. Andy is also a personal friend and mentor to me, and really one of the real reasons why I got involved in jazz and decided to pursue a professional career as a jazz bassist. I highly urge you to check out his website and his books at andyjaffe.com. It features some of his compositions, it has an MP3 sampler, and ways that you can order his books and CDs. This interview is slightly over an hour long, and I hope you guys continue watching. We have interviews coming up with Mulgrew Miller, Michelle Rosewoman, David Gilmour, and Kevin Norton, just to name a few of the people that are coming up. So please subscribe and comment on these videos and stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the wonderful opportunity to interview a personal friend and mentor of mine in the study of jazz, Andy Jaffe, who is a wonderful leader worldwide in the field of jazz pedagogy and an excellent composer and top-class jazz pianist. Andy, for people who aren't familiar with your background, could you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you originally got involved in music, at a young age?
Okay, so I was born in Washington, D.C., and lived there for 5 or 6 years. And then we moved to a place called Monroe, New York, outside the city. And then when I was in high school, for my 4 years of high school, we moved to Amherst, Mass. And my whole life, my family surrounded us with music. My father was an amateur musician and had some pretty good tastes in music, and so when we were kids we were listening to a wide variety of things, just exposed to it in the house, And then my next door neighbor in New York was a trumpet player, and he was really into Louis Armstrong and Al Hirsch, so we had this band when I was, I don't know, maybe 10 years old. We play like Hello Dolly and stuff like that, when it was a popular hit, at that time, dating myself,
Great,
I guess. And then when I moved to Amherst, I had some friends who were really into blues, which was very popular then, so I was in a blues band. We played like Paul Butterfield, James Cotton type of stuff, Sam and Dave, and that's where I first got into, transcribing horn parts and stuff. No doubt those transcriptions were all completely wrong, but it did figure out stuff for the horn players in the band to play.
The practice.
And I should say that before that too, that I had classical lessons for a while, but I rapidly realized that I was not a great classical player, and that I didn't really like. Maybe it was the style of the teacher I had. You know, she was very strict. You know, if you couldn't balance a coin on the back of your hands playing your scales, she would rap you with a ruler. You know, but she was good friends with my parents, so it was a little bit awkward to get out of doing it. But eventually, I just stopped doing those classical lessons and sort of was self-taught because there weren't really jazz piano teachers or jazz piano books. Maybe Mohegan was just seeing the light of day then, but I didn't know about it.
And you did a little bit of clarinet and bassoon as well?
Yeah, clarinet was like 5th grade, and you know, it was like basically so I could be in the band. And I was, you know, if you've seen, you know, elementary school bands, you know, there's bazillion clarinet players, and I was in the 3rd row. So at one point, the director said to me, "Yeah, well, you know, if you want to keep playing in the band, you got to play one of these instruments we got in the closet because we have too many clarinet players." So I picked up the bassoon for a while, and I stayed at it through the end of graduate school. But you know, the word "fagotto," which is Italian for bassoon that you see in the scores, you know, it means bundle of sticks, and that's basically what it sounded like when I played it. So
I'm sure it didn't sound that bad.
No, my greatest accomplishment was learning part of Illinois Jacquette's solo on Round Midnight, which he recorded on bassoon. But you know, it's a nice thing to know about. But basically, it got me into a lot of nice performance situations too, a lot of orchestral situations that I probably was not such a high-level player to be able to be involved in, but was able to get that experience. And there's nothing like being inside a band, whatever kind of band it is, to learn about that literature.
And you began kind of teaching yourself jazz in high school.
Yeah.
And just from listening to records and...
Well, I had a very hip high school music teacher, though I didn't take music courses with him outside of being in the orchestra, but he was a good jazz pianist. His name is John Maggs. He actually lives right around the corner down in Pumpkin Hollow now. He retired and moved out here, unbeknownst to me. And he really knew about like voicings and voice leading and all that stuff, so I would just kind of look over his shoulder and try and absorb what I could, but it wasn't a formalized kind of training. You know, in that time, most of us learned how to play by playing with other people. If you're lucky, you got to play with older people who knew some tunes. And the other opportunity, of course, was just learning things off record, you know. At a time when you did transcriptions by dropping the needle and picking it back up, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, I would hook on to something and then just try and figure it out. I remember when when I was doing this was right around the time that say, My Favorite Things, and I remember very, very clearly when A Love Supreme came out, and we all went to my friend's house and listened to it together. But, wow, what is this? What's going on? But like that little vamp that McCoy Tyner plays on Summertime, those 2 chords, I can remember sitting in the front room trying to figure out what those 2 chords were, just playing them over and over the way it is on the record. And my dad, who really didn't understand modern jazz at all, would come in and be like, "Are those the only chords you know?" I said, "Dad, I don't know them yet. I'm trying to figure them out, you know?"
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a rough road when you're teaching yourself, but you do learn the lessons pretty deeply. You know, those things that I listened to at that time, that I listened to over and over and over, are still sort of probably the main body of the core of my musical self.
Well, that's great, you know. And you graduated from St. Lawrence University in 1973 with a degree in political science, but during that time that you were at the university, you actually studied in Europe, the university in Switzerland, in Geneva. While you were there, you studied jazz privately. When did you decide that you really wanted to get into jazz professionally?
That's a great question. I actually, well, I don't know if professionally is quite the right word, but you know, when you're drawn to something or when it chooses you, you know, then that's when you make that decision, I suppose. And I had felt that way since high school, though I didn't have like the ability to really do anything with it. And when I finished high school, I really wanted to go to Berkeley, to go to music school right away. My parents didn't want to pay for music school, and I had to be in college or I would have been drafted. This was during Vietnam, you know. Mm-hmm. And so I stayed at St. Lawrence and finished that degree, Path of Least Resistance. But like most liberal arts colleges, I'm not singling them out, because you could say this about any place that's not a music school. The music curriculum was very Eurocentric, and it just wasn't something I was drawn to, so I didn't really do that. And I had bands there that I put together with friends. We were a few miles down the road from Crane School of Music, which is a New York State school conservatory, and there were some people there who could actually play jazz. So I had an opportunity again to play with people who had more experience and to cultivate a little bit more ability. But when I was in Europe, I had to do an orientation program before I went to Geneva, and I lived in Paris for a while to do that. And I met this guy named Lou Saul, who was a student of Nadia Boulanger, and a very hip guy, and he said, "You got to come hear this jazz pianist." So we went down to the left bank, and I met this guy named Michel Sardabie, who's from Martinique. I don't think he's alive anymore, I'm not sure. But he gave me piano lessons, and that was a real education, because he really knew how to play, This guy could really play. And it was very straight ahead, and I didn't know anything about phrasing or rhythm. I didn't know any tunes, Didn't know voicings that I could play them in all the keys, and like a lot of kids when they sort of self-teach, they wind up with a lot of gaps in their knowledge. And he was the first person to really hold me to account on all those basics, and he was very strict, and I really liked studying with him. And then when I was in the University of Geneva, there wasn't much music happening there, but I did hook up with some local Swiss musicians and play a bunch of gigs, and that was kind of cool. They didn't know much more than me, but we got to go out and play some, so that was nice.
That's great.
So then when I finished St. Lawrence, I basically worked for a while and saved money, and was able to go to Berkeley, and I suppose those are your next line of questions there.
Yeah. You worked. You studied at Berkeley in the mid '70s, 74, I believe. And when you studied over there, how was Berkeley at that time?
Well, Berkeley was a very sophisticated music school with people from all over the world. And, the drawback to it then was that a lot of the faculty were just people who just went there, and because it paid so badly, that was mostly who they got to teach there. And so they had people who did know a lot more than you did, who were teaching your classes, or maybe they weren't even older than you. And that happened a lot when you get like these students coming from abroad who, have a lot of experience, and they come to Berkeley and they're older than the faculty and maybe have more background. So there was a little awkwardness around that. But, you also had like Herb Pomeroy and people like that, and you had some really great, private teachers and so forth. And you got to hear a lot of great music. So.
And who were some of your contemporaries at that time?
God, I'm trying to, here's where I may fail with the memory. This guy was great. He taught me stride piano. So he had played with Charlie Parker when he would come to Boston. He made me learn tunes. Pat Metheny had just been there and left, or something like that. I'm trying to think. Other people, if I said their names, you might not know them, but they're still teaching there today, or they're still involved with the place. But nobody all that famous that I can remember.
Well, how was the scene like around the university there in Boston, or college?
I think in the 70s,
great jazz scene there.
Yeah, there were just a million places to play. I mean, you didn't make a lot of money, but you could go out and play at like Pooh's Pub, or what was that place? Oh God, I'm forgetting all these names. There's the Eliot Lounge, which was basically a jock bar, like you'd go in there, all the famous basketball players and football players and marathon runners would all be hanging out there, and you could get a solo piano gig there now and then. And a lot of places over in Cambridge and Somerville too. So there were actually quite a few places to play, and at night everybody, I'm sure it's still true, get sign out a practice room, get a group together, learn some tunes, write some charts. You could write. They had project bands, so you could sign up for a slot, bring in a chart, even if you weren't in that particular course, and just get stuff played and hear what it sounded like.
And the fusion scene at that point in time was pretty
Yeah, everybody wanted to play Chick Corea, Return to Forever, and, that was kind of boring but de rigueur because everybody was doing it, and that's just the way it was. And, it's true today, too. It's different music today. I see it in my own students where, the students know, this is not to fault any particular generation of students, because the students know what draws them into the music. The stuff that draws them into the music they're impassioned about, and they always will be. Just like I was talking to you before about my favorite things, or you know, Kind of Blue, or any of these records I listened to when I was a kid. Wow, this stuff is great, and that's always going to be at the core of your being as a musician. But as a rule, people don't go back and study the music that influenced the people who they like to listen to. And so, you know, when you hear Chick Corea play Return to Forever, it sounds one way. When you hear somebody else who's only heard Chick Corea and hasn't had the experiences he had that got him to that point, it doesn't sound the same. You know, there's just something about digging back. I remember when Branford came to Williams, and he was scolding my students at one point, and he said, you know, if you want to sound like Coltrane, it's not enough to listen to Coltrane. You've got to listen to what he listened to, and that's really true. And most people don't do that. Most people of any generation aren't really that interested in what happened before they were born, musically.
Yeah, and that's
and
important.
it's really important to study that stuff. It's really important to do your work on that.
Yeah,
I'd say most of my career as a composer and so forth, that's what I've been trying to do, is to dig back, and the further back you go, the more challenging the music is, and the more interesting and the less stylized it is. Because, and you might find this ironic for me to say this as a music educator and author, but before we had books and stuff, the music seemed to be a lot more spontaneous because it wasn't codified. I think you'd probably say that about Bach too. Look how beautiful and spontaneous Bach's music is.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been that way if he'd have studied all the rules of Bach counterpoint that people, you know, took from his music later on and made sort of like how you're supposed to learn music. You know?
Yeah, yeah.
But he wasn't burdened by that. He just wrote what he heard.
Yeah.
He was a genius.
So yeah, you finished up Berkeley, and at that point in time, you went and studied jazz composition at the University of Massachusetts Amherst.
Yeah.
And over there, you actually worked kind of as an assistant director of the jazz program under mentors Max Roach and Frederick Tillis. How was that working with those guys, and especially working with Max?
I mean, yeah, of course. Let's talk about that in a minute, but let's add a couple of steps. When I finished Berkeley, I didn't really graduate because I already had a degree. Basically, this is true probably for a lot of people. I ran out of money, so I was just working to pay the rent and so forth, and studying privately with Hugo Norden, who was teaching at BU at that time, a real fantastic composition teacher who knew Bach and Bartok and all this stuff, just inside out. So I was trying to get into grad school someplace, but I didn't have the classical background that I could get in because I had missed all of that traditional harmony stuff. So he was sort of putting me in shape on that, and I was continuing to write music. And around that time, I won a composition grant through the Artist Foundation, which is a Boston-based group. And it was the first year they ever had any grants that were not European composition. So it was a jazz composition award per se. And the judges on that board, I think Max may have been a judge, but Billy Taylor was for sure. So they both said to me, hey, why don't you go to UMass? So that's how I actually wound up there. And being assistant director basically meant, you know, with very little experience, I was thrown in there as like, here, teach this jazz harmony course. Are there any books? No, there weren't any books. So I wrote a syllabus, and that was the beginning of my writing career, I suppose. And here, run this second big band. And when Max would go to Europe, he'd say, here, run this small group, you know, and I'd go to look for my charts, and he had taken them with him, so I didn't have anything for them to play, so I have to write stuff really fast, you know. But it was an inspiration working with Max, because he didn't suffer fools lightly. And looking back on it, it was an interesting thing in so many ways, because, you know, he was one of the first real jazz musicians to be an academe, and it was a big deal, and there was a lot of resistance to what he was doing, and he had to deal with that resistance, that dark side of the Eurocentric sort of attitude that pervades music faculty throughout the world. It's not, I found out, by the way, in traveling, that it's not just in America, that some places overseas the schism is even worse. But anyway, so it was interesting from a musical perspective because, you know, he'd tell me all things about Clifford Brown and Charlie Parker that nobody else could tell you, you know.
Yeah, like what kind of stuff did he tell you?
Well, like, for example, most people don't know that Charlie Parker played the Bach Conventions at the piano. Max told me that. And looking at the lines that that I, show students all the time things from Bach conventions and things in Charlie Parker solos. They're almost the same. Not that he took stuff out of there, but the point is that they both have in common the genius of expressing the harmony in the line. When you listen to Charlie Parker line or to a line in a Bach convention, you know what the chord changes are, but you never hear more than one note at a time. And it's made clear in that way. And these people define harmonic style on the basis of one note at a time. And he told me some great things about Clifford and playing with that group, and about Richie Powell. And it's just a great, and then he, of course, shared a lot of his own contemporary musical experiences at the time. For example, I don't know if you know about this group, You know about them? The
No.
10 percussionists that he had. I think 10 is the right number. It's apostrophe M and then boom, B-O-O-M. They're recorded on Columbia. And, he wrote some really great music he was a fantastic composer, write music for himself with a brass quintet or for double quartet. I did a lot with him on that too, with his daughter Maxine's string quartet, the Uptown String Quartet, and his own quartet with Cecil Bridgewater and Odine Pope and Calvin Hill. And Calvin Hill was a marathon runner too, by the way. We used to run together in Central Park. I don't know if he's still at it. But in any event, so it was very interesting, like when Max recorded Bloom, I went to that session in the studio and saw all this room full of percussion and learned a lot about, look at all the things you can do with percussion, look at how varied it can be, how rich it can be. Mm-hmm. But then he'd also share things with me, like he'd say, oh, we got a meeting, let's go see this meeting. So we'd go there and it'd be just a bunch of kind of, I don't want to make any characterizations, but administrative people, talking about the concert season for next year and who we could get and who we couldn't get and what, the money and all this stuff. And I remember sitting there scratching my head and thinking, why on earth is he bringing me to see this? But then in the years since I've been involved with administration and stuff, I look back on that and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I should have been paying a lot more attention. But he didn't let you, musically speaking, he held you to task. And I think sometimes, speaking for myself, and probably it's true for some other colleagues of mine in liberal arts institutions, maybe less so than in conservatories, we tend to sort of tolerate a lot of lack of precision and lack of practicing and preparation on the part of our students that he would never have tolerated, And he didn't come from, he had gone to Manus, but he didn't come from a conservatory background. That wasn't driving his sense of perfectionism. It was because he played with the best people in the world. Yeah. He expected he knew what it took to take care of business on that level, and if you didn't do that, he would let you know. And that's something that was a lesson that I maybe didn't learn well enough, because I haven't been as harsh on people as I should have been in terms of that over the years, looking at the way I've related with my students.
Well, I wouldn't, I would say that you've turned out some really great students.
Yeah, but it's not a matter of me turning them out, it's a matter of, them taking the initiative, and sometimes you need to be more forceful than maybe I have been.
And now, after you graduated from University of Amherst with a master's in composition,
mm-hmm.
and after that, if I would fast forward for some people who are checking this out, more than 25 years later, you received an award from the IAJE for the outstanding service to jazz education. So, we'll now go backwards and talk about the time when you first started really being a teacher.
Yeah.
And I guess you began teaching at Berkeley, right?
Yeah. Well, after I finished UMass, it was funny because I don't remember exactly how it happened, but before I knew it, they were calling me to Berkeley to go there and teach, So I went there as way too young a person with way too little experience, and sort of had some of the same connections I'd had a few years earlier when I was a student there. So I had some gigs to play, and I taught. And at that time, this is a place where you really hone your teaching skills. I remember, I'm not going to name any names, but one of my colleagues at UMass one time said to me, he was lamenting the fact that he had to do 2 preparations in one day, prepare for 2 classes.
Yeah.
And so like at Berkeley, when you went there, you taught 6 classes and 7 ensembles a week, 3 semesters a year, including summers. So it meant basically no preparation at all, no office, 40 hours a week in the classroom. So you like get there at 8 in the morning and teach a class, and sometimes the 9 o'clock class was in the next building, and you're running around, and it was kind of amazing. So, you know, you really learn how to teach in a circumstance like that because you don't have any time to waste, and you get a wide range of students. Luckily, I got somehow, maybe it's because I had this advanced degree in harmony and composition, I got put in the higher level classes, you know, teaching with the better students. So I had ensembles with guys who could really play, and I had like
some really great guys.
Yeah, like I had an ensemble with Scott Robinson and Scott Mullet in it, you know. Karis Liebman played oboe in that band. She's Dave's wife now. I played with, I had a band that had all kinds of great, you know, later on.
Wallace Roney and
Wallace
Branford.
They were more, let me see if I can remember exactly. Branford was in an arranging 2 class, and it was kind of a big class, and the students were much faster than the level they were placed in, and they were bored with it. They were really drugged with how slow it was moving, because everything's codified at Berklee in terms of the pacing at the different levels, and you really can't deviate too much. But I just said, what the hell? So I challenged them. I said, okay, you guys are bored with this material. Here's what I want you to do. We're going to complement the players we have in this class, and we're going to make a big band, and you're going to write a big band chart. So they all went around and found their friends, and lo and behold, in like the next class, we had a full big band, and they started writing these charts, and they were really quite good.
Wow.
And then I had Smitty in an ensemble, and Smitty, of course, was generous enough to play with me in my own band that I had at that time. It was my first sextet. And
Marvin Smitty Smith.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. He was great. He came to school. I remember the semester, I think it was 79 or 80, he and Phil Person, this trumpet player, teaches at Berklee now, great trumpet player. They both came into this ensemble at like 18. You know, and Phil looked like Dennis the Menace, and Smitty was this skinny little kid, you know, and they both played so well. I was like, wow, these guys are amazing. And so I began to play a lot. And then when the jazz composition program per se began at Berklee, I was in on kind of the ground floor of that. And I taught this jazz composition class where they were supposed to transcribe stuff, and then, you know, that was part of their writing, and then, of course, write original music. So Smitty took a couple of courses with me in that, and he was a really outstanding arranger, you know. And he had perfect pitch, and he had the best calligraphy, because this is before music software.
Yeah.
And Smitty could have been a professional calligrapher. His handwriting was impeccable. And like, I remember he transcribed something from that Cannonball Adderley record that Yusef's on, Planet Earth, that sextet record.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, and it was like great, you know, and Wallace transcribed some Blakey thing, because obviously he was into that. And you know who else was in that class was Steve Vai. Do you know who he is?
Yeah,
So
excellent metal guitarist.
Yeah, so he was in his class, and he transcribed Frank Zappa.
Wow.
And the story I love to tell people is he says, you know, I really want to get a gig with Zappa. What do I do? I said, why don't you transcribe something and send it to him? So he transcribed, like, in those days it was the side of a record, like a whole bunch of tunes, and sent it to Zappa. And he got a gig with Zappa.
Wow.
So every time I see him on TV, it cracks me up, you know.
Yeah,
He's a good guy.
He's a crazy guitar player.
But these guys
Technical.
worked so hard, man. They were all really good, hard-working students, you know, and they didn't screw around. And Smitty writes really good original music. I don't know if you know this record of his, The Road Not Taken. Yeah, you should check that out.
Check that out.
Very, very. I don't know. It's been around a while. Marty plays it all the time. It's very fine writing. I mean, he's a really good composer.
Well, great. I mean, and then kind of you did eventually record with a couple of these guys.
Yeah,
Branford and Wallace.
I went to New York after a few years, and it's funny you should be interviewing me today, because, you know, just a day or two ago, we had Fred Hirsch play at Williams.
Mm-hmm.
And Fred Hirsch at that time had just moved to New York. He still lives in the same place, I think. But at that point, it was a studio called Classic Sound. So actually recorded this record with Branford and Wallace and Smitty. Lou Harless was the bass player. Tom Olin played doubles, baritone, and piccolo when I used the fourth horn. Who am I forgetting? Maybe that's it.
And that's Manhattan Projections? Is
Yeah,
that the
yeah.
album?
Hey, so we recorded it in Fred's studio.
Wow.
So I was just with Fred a couple of days ago for a couple of days while he was at Williams. He gave an absolutely spectacular concert, and see, it's 4 o'clock. Any minute now, they're going to decide whether or not he gets the solo piano Grammy this year.
Well, hopefully he does.
I got my fingers crossed. He certainly deserves it. That record alone with the Village Vanguard is pretty much what he really sounds like in person. That's really, really impressive, man, what he can play.
Yeah.
And the influences he draws on.
Mm-hmm.
And the music is very deep, too. It's not just that it's great technically and pianistically and compositionally, but it's just very deep.
Well, that's great. I mean, and at that point, you were in New York.
Yeah.
How was the New York scene at that point?
Oh, you know, it's like really probably not that much different than it is today. I suppose the 80s were the vestiges of a turning point in terms of the way music was produced, you know, because it was the beginning of the CD era and the digital age, and so that was changing a lot of stuff about like how music was recorded and presented and stuff. But there were still elements of the old kind of way of living there. For example, I would play club dates on weekends, which at that time meant schlepping a Fender Rhodes, you know, to some address that the guy gave you on Thursday night when you called them up, and some booking agent, you know, and you go there and play a bunch of tunes on Saturday afternoon with these people who were total strangers. You may not have ever seen them before, and there was never a bass player because they were supposed to play left-hand bass with a keyboard, you know. And you know, you might be doing any kind of medley of Italian tunes or Jewish tunes, or you know, at that time disco was big, so you played Celebration every gig, and the whole thing was to, you know, when the people kept dancing for a while, maybe you could take it out a little bit and the tenor player would have some fun, you know. But you know, it was pretty circumscribed what you could play. And so I did that, and the theory always was you could do that during the weekend, and then the rest of the week you could go to rehearsal bands and get stuff played and record stuff on your own, do what you really were impassioned by, go hear music. It was a great time to go hear music.
Yeah, what kind of clubs did you check out
well,
at the time?
What was the name of this place down on First Avenue and about 30th Street? I'll think of it in a minute. So a bunch of people down there. But of course, for piano, there was Bradley's. So even if you're lucky enough to have a gig, you go there afterwards, and you could just hang out all night, listen to Hank Jones or Kenny Barron, or you know.
Awesome. Yeah.
Al Haig had a steady gig up on 39th Street at this place called Griff's. It was just a little restaurant gig. Al Haig, Dennis Irwin, and Frank Gant, and they played like all the Powell tunes and stuff. It was just amazing. Just amazing.
And this is kind of the loft scene at that time.
No, it was after that.
Still a little bit after the loft.
There were jam sessions. One of the jam sessions I always went to was in we used to call it Alphabet City, over to the east of First Avenue there.
Sure.
And there was this place, University of the Streets, I want to say. They had
I think it's still there.
Sessions, you know.
Yeah.
And there was a club right around there that I used to play, Princess Pamela's Little Kitchen, and you know, her buzzer was broken, and so you'd have to yell up from the street. She'd lean out the window and then let you in. And you'd go up there, and this old bass player and drummer, whose names I've long since forgotten, these guys from Harlem. They were great players. They knew every tune. And it was a very small little venue. And she would be in there, and she'd cook for everybody. And then she'd walk out, dramatically take off her apron, and walk to the bandstand and start singing. It was the funkiest place. Last time I went to try and look her up, it had burned down, though. So I don't know what happened to her, you know. But there were lots of little gigs like that around town, and you could go see a lot of people. I played for a minute, you know, subbing at Sweet Basil's and the solo piano thing, and then I get to see the show that came afterwards. You know, it was $35 and dinner, and get to hang out and see Gil Evans or whoever was playing that night. And so I saw a lot of good music.
That's great.
And that was the point, to see music and to meet other musicians and to network. But the trouble is, after a while, I started to get more gigs out of town, and so I wound up not being there that much, you know. But it was good. It was a good springboard to go play in Europe and so forth.
Yeah, that's
Meet
great.
a lot of people, write a lot of music. A lot of the music I have in my big band book that Bill Lowe and I we started our band not till '86 when we met, but a lot of the music in that book is stuff that I started to play in this band that I had down there. I co-led a band at this place called Duffy's Tavern, which was kind of a well-known big band haunt in the 40s, and then I'm sure it's not there anymore. It had become like totally, I don't know, destitute kind of neighborhood, you know. Sometimes you'd actually trip over people on the way in, right next to Port Authority, and the worst piano you ever heard. But, you know, a bunch of great players, being New York, you get in there and you get your stuff played by really great musicians, you know, every Monday night.
Yeah.
We're still playing some of that same music, you know.
Yeah, you composed quite a bit of stuff. I mean, some of that was released on an album, Imperfect Storm, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And you recorded partially with the Bill Lowe, Andy Jaffe repertory band.
Yeah.
And also with the Slovak Radio Orchestra big band
Yeah,
there in Europe.
yeah. Well, the record label had a connection. I had this orchestra piece, and the record label had a connection with these Eastern European orchestras, which are pretty much, you know, they used to be studio orchestras where the guys would punch a clock 40 hours a week and go in and play every kind of music you can imagine, right?
Yeah.
And then,
amazing.
of course, when the socialist systems went down, they had to privatize, and they started to, you know, rent themselves out for hire. So this turned out that this piece and this involving an orchestra and a big band could be done over there at a reasonable price. So Tom McClung by then was already living in Europe, so he came down, and Bruce Williamson went over with me to play, and they had a hookup with Richard Stoltzman, so he played, the label I mean, so he played on it too. And then we combined that with a bunch of the unreleased stuff that we had from the big band. It was good stuff, there just wasn't quite enough of it to make a CD.
Sure. Well, and then you also taught in Europe. You taught in France for a while at the Institut Musical de Formation Professionnelle in Nimes.
Yeah.
And that was in 1984.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about teaching there?
Well, a kind of interesting system, you know. In France, professional musicians are eligible for unemployment. You can imagine that here, right?
Wow.
So, because a lot of their gigs are seasonal, so they go do a tour with some show band or whatever they do, and they come back and they file for unemployment, and their unemployment pays for classes. So that's who this guy designed this school for, these musicians who are off the road in between gigs, and government paid the whole thing, you know.
Excellent.
It's socialism, you know. That's how they do things. So, but it was a little funky organizationally. I don't want to disparage anybody, but you know, I didn't wind up staying. But it was a good experience, and got to play some festivals there, meet some expatriate American musicians who were on the faculty there, like Al Levitt, who was one of the Lenny Tristano, you know, acolytes who wound up settling over there. And great drummer. Played a lot with who's the Algerian pianist? You know who I mean? Guy who plays like Oscar Peterson, Marshall Salal.
And what was your general impression of the scene there in France and in Europe at that time?
Well, I don't know. There seemed to be a lot of work, a lot of people touring around. I think it's still true. There were a lot of festivals. I've still gone to play more of them over the years, and it's just a great place for Americans to go and play. And at that time, which I think is less true now, the general assumption was that the European musicians weren't as good, that you wouldn't hire them if you could avoid it. But I think now there's just a whole couple generations since then, and they can play as well as anybody. So a lot more American musicians, when they go there, they'll like sort of fill out their band with people who are local. Because, you know, it's expensive to fly over there and everything now. It's almost prohibitive, you know.
They used to do that a lot with Niels Henning, Orson Peterson.
Oh, sure.
He used to stay there and be the bass player for all the big guys.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, you look at some of those records, like A Day in Copenhagen, that Dexter Gordon record with the Slide Hampton charts. That's fantastic stuff, you know. And there's a lot of great bands now. The Dutch Radio Jazz Orchestra, they did all those Strayhorn recordings. They're superb. And there's lots of other good musicians.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of Italian musicians who are, for example, great at Brazilian music. You know, you could hear Italian players play bossa nova and it'd be totally authentic. It's amazing.
Wow. Yeah. And I mean, it must have been great to be in Europe at that time. Still, like kind of right before everybody. So you kind of had some prominence over there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it was the first place, you know, I ever, you know, played a festival on my own name and all that kind of stuff. It was nice.
And then, kind of fast forwarding, in 1988, you began teaching jazz at Williams College.
Yeah.
That's nearly 25 years.
I know.
And,
Tell me about it.
you're the director of the program there, and how has it been to shape the jazz program there and teach from there? I know
Well,
it's must have been
well, you know, first of
a
all,
long time.
it's a long time, and you have some students who are really outstanding. In any liberal arts college setting, you're going to have some students who come with a lot of talent and a lot of background, and they've kind of decided or are about to decide while they're there that this is something they want to do. And first example of that I had at Williams was Chris Lightcap, who was the bass player
big
when
guy. Yeah.
you know, David Keckley, who was my predecessor running the big band and who hired me to do it, he says, "Oh, I think you're going to like the bass player." That was an understatement. So we've had a number of people like that. But you know, you're not going to get an entire population like that, because the culture of an institution like Williams or Amherst or Harvard or, you know, you name it, the academics are so demanding that the culture of the institution doesn't support what you need to do as a player, like practicing 4 or 5 hours a day and that kind of thing.
Sure.
And it doesn't surround you in an environment where other student players are at that level. So, you know, you have to make compromises, and the agenda of the academic curriculum is pretty Eurocentric. It's improving. It's trying to be inclusive, and people mean well in that regard, but it's not the same as being at a jazz school. And it's a funny thing, because a lot of the places that are liberal arts colleges, like Williams, I'm proud to say, are more progressive in their inclusion of music that is non-Western, quote unquote, and we could argue about whether or not jazz is Western music, you know, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That you get outside of the Eurocentric canon, and a lot of the progress in terms of, you know, getting rid of those arbitrary categories that constrain people's abilities to cross boundaries like that. A lot of it's being initiated by non-music schools, by liberal arts colleges, because you go to a lot of conservatories in this country, and there are exceptional ones like NEC where the boundaries are breaking down, but then there are a lot of others where the boundaries aren't breaking down, and it's hard to take lessons in jazz and in classical on the same instrument, and it's hard to write music that borrows from traditions, you know, because people are resistant to it for no reason, just because they've been uncritical in their assessment of those categories, you know. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things we teach at a liberal arts college, you know, is critical thinking. You're supposed to look at any situation you're in and say, wait, what are the underlying assumptions here? Do they make any sense?
Yeah. Well, you did a lot, and you've done a lot there at Williams. I mean, you are teaching courses in ear training, theory, improvisation, arranging, composition, and a lot on the music at Duke, Ellington, and Coltrane.
Yeah, I'm teaching Duke right now. It's one of my great pleasures in life. Every time I teach this course, I've been doing it for over 20 years, you know, and every time I teach this course, I look forward to reading all the assignments, you know, before each class, even though I've read them like 15 times, you know. You find something new every time, not just the reading, but, you know, there's new scholarship all the time. The proliferation of jazz scholarship these days is amazing, especially in regards to Duke. And there's a lot of real interesting music to study. You can never get to all of his music. And that's why I call it Introduction to the Music of Duke Ellington.
Sure, yeah.
But you try and get to the underlying concepts. And also, it's important. I find it's more important, maybe it's because I've been doing it 20 years and times have changed and it's a new generation of students, but maybe it's because I've just come to this awareness that the cultural context in which the music was produced is something students don't know about either. So students don't know, you know, what it was like for Duke Ellington to live in a segregated society, because they've never had that experience. Today's students I'm talking about. And they don't understand what it was like for bands to be on the road and all those things, and so I try to take advantage of as much opportunity as I can with the readings that we do to help students understand what it was like, the environment in which the music was produced, what that was like, and how it affected it.
Yeah, that's really great. Nowadays a lot of people don't have that road experience, so it's good to give them that that background. And you're also a leader in writing advanced texts. You wrote a text, I think it first came out in the 90s, Jazz Harmony.
Yeah, actually, it was
Advanced.
before that. There was a book called Jazz Theory way back in the '80s, and
Yeah.
and if you find a copy on eBay or something like that, there's a picture of Billy Taylor's hands on the cover. You know, I didn't know who it was for the longest time, and then one time I was showing this jazz history film strip in a jazz history course, and he was announcing, you know, he was the narrator, and they freeze framed this picture, and there it was, the cover of my book. So I said, hey,
Wow.
Dr. Taylor, did you know those are your hands on the cover of my book? Because, you know, he had written an endorsement for the book and everything, and we were good friends by then. He got
Sure.
a good laugh out of that. And so, yeah, then that became re-released, as it were, by Advanced Music, Hans Gruber's company, and called Jazz Harmony, and it's been through 3 editions, and it's, I don't know, it's 14,000 copies and several printings later. And
Yeah,
used all
your
over
text
the
has
world.
been all over the world,
Yeah.
used quite a bit.
Yeah.
What was kind of some of your formula to writing the book? I mean, it's just...
Well, to be absolutely honest, and I think this gets to the whole notion of, like, jazz is an oral tradition, right? Like, if you're going to write good music, you go out on the bandstand and you play with people and you understand how the dynamics of the bandstand work, you know, and you learn from that. And so the arrangements you write, the compositions that you write, even if they're written out note for note, like Duke wrote many pieces that have no improvisation, but they work stylistically because he wrote things that were, you know, idiomatic and legitimate within the style. Well, I brought that to my teaching too, and so when I wrote that book, I said, I'm going to write exactly what I do in the same sequence as when I teach the class because I know it works. And so that's basically what I did. And to be honest, I don't remember which edition it was. Maybe it was in '96 when Advance first took it. When I was rewriting it, at that time I was teaching at Amherst and at Williams and some other places, and I was just on the road all the time. You know, it was crazy. So I'd be driving up Route 2, you know, and I'd have this little micro cassette recorder, and I'd be dictating stuff and editing it and listening to it back while I was driving. You know, I was the ultimate distracted driver, I suppose. And then
Yeah.
we had an au pair at that time, and part of her gig, you know, in exchange for rent was she would transcribe the stuff I wrote and type it up, right? And then I would review it and edit it. You know, but basically that book was written in its current incarnation driving around commuting to work on this micro cassette player. But it was based on, it was easy to do because it was based on what I do and the sequence in which I teach the stuff and how I choose the repertoire to explore. It's hard, you know, to explore just one topic at a time when you're teaching harmony because music in real world doesn't work that way. You have to get lucky to find a tune that just works to talk about modes or just works to talk about,
Sure. Yeah.
you know, melodic embellishment or whatever it might be. There's secondary dominance, you know. I mean, there's a nice repertoire you can choose from to do these things, but you have to really be careful about the sequence you do it in, especially since at a liberal arts college you're often going to get the weirdest combination of students you would ever expect in a soup to nuts kind of all-comers gateway course for jazz harmony. You've got some students with a classical background who can read anything but never improvise. You got rock guitar players who can't read, and you got, you know, sorry to be stereotypical, and you got, you know, people with some jazz experience, and so you got to keep it challenging for everybody on the level that they're at and try to do a uniform program also and cover a specific agenda of topics. It can be very challenging.
Sure. I mean, it's you do a really good job. I mean, I've read the text, and you're also coming out with, or you just came out with another book entitled "Something Borrowed, Something Blue."
Yeah.
And that was a subject of a presentation you did in 2005, correct?
Yeah. Well, that was kind of the headline presentation of the IAGJE conference in LA in, I think, 2005. You're right. Yeah. And so, you know, I'd been working on it for a while, but it just finally came out this last fall on Advanced Music also, and hopefully that'll enjoy a few, you know, editions and printings and.
Great. Yeah.
So, and it's sort of a summary of my analytical work, I suppose, or if you like, of various jazz composers that I consider important.
And sure, I also after I remember we talked about you getting some administrative experience from Max Roach. Kind of moving on from 1999 till 2010. Unfortunately, you served as the artistic director of the Williamstown Jazz Festival.
Yeah.
The reason I say unfortunately is because it was discontinued.
Yeah, well, we lost our funding from the college after 11 years. I think it might have been 2009 was the last year.
But you single-handedly, by some accounts, created the whole festival, and it's a full-fledged collegiate festival.
Well, it started as an intercollegiate festival where basically my buddies from the jazz education world, because I knew everybody I had this little cohort of friends from these different institutions I taught at or interacted with, and they would all come to Williams and we get adjudicators like Dr. Dempsey or Billy Pierce or James Williams or whoever it was, Herb Pomeroy. They would listen to the bands and critique them. And that actually went on for 18 years.
Wow.
And so that had been going on for about 7 years, and the people from the Chamber of Commerce approached me about starting a jazz festival. And they didn't know about the Intercollegiate Festival, of course, so we joined forces, and they had some money at that point. I asked the college for some money. The president was very generous to give us some funding. And then I wrote some grants, and we put together this thing which became an interdisciplinary festival that involved Mass MoCA and Clark Art Institute, different performance venues, involved dance, involved a gospel concert every year. It was a real interesting thing. Sometimes it would be 10 days long.
Yeah,
overall.
you had some real great names that came through, including Charles Lloyd, Benny Green,
Yeah,
Stephaan Harris, Ravi Coltrane, Joe
Yeah.
Lovano,
yeah,
Robert Glasper, Vanguard Orchestra.
yeah.
all the big names.
We got a lot of those people too. At the beginning we had a big band every year, then the chamber, you know, with the economy, this is all trickle down kind of stuff in a negative sense, unfortunately. As the state economy started to tank, towns and cities started to lose their money, and so they wound up without resources. So after the first few years we couldn't afford big bands anymore. So we still had some nice headline acts, as you mentioned, and I prided myself in getting a lot of these people on their way up before they became super famous and inaccessible financially. So we had Regina Carter. Actually, I think Chris played with her. We had Tom Harrell. Freddie Bryant played with him. We had Stephaan Harris before he became super famous. I think part of what I know, because I talked to him personally, and part of why he agreed to do it is because he's originally from Albany. You know, when he was in high school, he used to ride over for Birch's Symphony rehearsals with our clarinet teacher, Susan Martula, who lives in Troy. And so he had a sort of an emotional connection to the area and was willing to do it. Glasper, people didn't know too much when I brought him up here. And you know, and so on.
And Miguel Zenon.
Miguel Zenon, yeah. Unfortunately, I wasn't here for that. That was the last event. Freddie Bryant was running that in my stead because I was on leave. I was actually on leave in Taiwan when I heard about the decision that they weren't going to fund the festival anymore. It was, you know, when the financial crisis hit, a lot of things got caught.
Yeah, you got backstabbed.
Well, you know, I wouldn't say that. It's just that, you know, there wouldn't have been anything I could have done about it if I'd have been here the way it was, and because of the funding source and the nature of it. But you know, I was sad to not have that anymore. It also helped us bring some high caliber students. We're still been very lucky with the students we're attracting to the program. We get some kids who can really play, who are still interested in coming. But you know, it was kind of a magnet, kind of put us on the map and distinguished us from our peer institutions.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we don't have it anymore. So.
Well, hopefully maybe the funding can come back.
That's
as
what
the
everybody
economy
says,
bounces.
but my response to that always is, yeah, but you're going to have to do the advocacy, because I'm not going to go back and ask again.
Well, I guess people, you can try and, if any of you guys watching this have a lot of money, you can help start up the Williamstown Jazz Festival again.
Yeah, it's not always that simple administratively, because we've had many occasions actually where people want to give money to start things, and the college kind of has its own way. All colleges have their own way of processing these requests, and they have to be initiated in a certain way, and yada yada yada. So you know, it's possible to do it, but I mean, actually my position is full-time, and I quit the other places because of the generosity of one of the Williams graduates who endowed this chair that I have. But that was not a simple matter either. It had to go through the whole process that they had.
Sure. Well, now kind of moving on, I have a few questions, big kind of esoteric questions regarding the future of jazz, especially with education in mind.
Okay.
There is a general impression by some that jazz should be learned on the streets, as the way that you kind of learned it. And there is a discontent by some that it's become a collegiate pursuit. As one of the top college professors and leaders in the field, what response do you have to this as one of the founding fathers?
Well, thank you. But I totally agree with all of that, actually. And I share these concerns. And again, I mentioned before, you may find it ironic that I would say this, being someone who's written so much about it and taught for so much. But really, you can't learn this from a book exclusively. You have to have that bandstand experience. I don't care if it's composition, arranging, performing, whatever it is. And maybe on the streets, maybe not, but just playing with other people, you know, and playing with people who are better. Playing with people who aren't going to let you use it like a real book, you know. That's really important. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with a real book per se, but when you get to the point of performing somewhere, you shouldn't be reading anything. Because reading music while you're playing is like wearing earplugs, you know. You shouldn't have. I mean, certainly people at the highest levels or people playing in a big band where you can't memorize everything are able to do both effectively. But most students, when they're just starting to learn, if they haven't memorized the music, it exacerbates all their biggest weaknesses. And the biggest problem with all the educational stuff that's been going on and with the kind of stylized teaching that's taken place, and I'm not going to name any names or institutions in that, but we all know what's happening with that, is that people learn by formulas, and they learn by reading, and they learn, and they don't foster their individuality as players in the same way as they would if they'd gone out and paid dues. And so you wind up with, whether you're listening to composers and arrangers or players, there's a lot of genericism out there now.
I totally agree.
There's too much freaking genericism. People sound the same. The arrangements sound the same. There's absolutely no individuality.
You can't distinguish who's on the radio anymore.
Yeah, when you listen to Duke Ellington, you know, Duke Ellington, I tell this all the time to my students, you know, he didn't just write a saxophone part. He wrote for that specific player. And when we wrote a voicing, it wasn't just about the 9th and the 13th and whatever. It was about who was playing those parts and which registers and what they sounded like in combination. And when he was characterizing somebody as a part of a piece, like a Shakespearean character, he chose someone in his band who had those same personal characteristics, you know? So he thought very deeply about individual expression. People in his band said that when he wrote a solo for them, they couldn't have played a better one, or couldn't have played one more like themselves than what he wrote for them, because he knew them that well. That's
not like
the
that
same.
anymore.
You go in, you go into like a band with a bunch of guys that you don't know and just throw a chart in front of them is not the same.
Yeah.
And that's what's missing. And the root cause of that is that there aren't enough places to play. If people had a chance to be out playing every night and they had a rehearsal band of their own, I still work hard to make that work. But Bill and I, we keep our big band together after 26 years. But I lose money every gig, you know?
Yeah.
That's just the nature of it. But if you don't make it happen, it's not going to happen. Because the economics of it are such that it's impossible to keep things going.
Yeah, I mean, and with that problem, nowadays jazz programs turn out thousands of jazz students per year.
Yeah, I know.
And a lot of them play for free. And this causes a problem for more established musicians.
Yeah, I know it does. Yeah, I know.
It's a dilemma. What do you suggest to fix this problem? Do we limit the students in programs? Do we make it more difficult to graduate from a program unless you've earned it?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I would say that. I mean, first of all, just a priori, it's a good idea to have more artists and musicians in the world. We should never circumscribe the amount of training that's available to people or limit the amount of music that's written or performed, because it just makes the world a better place. But in terms of pure economics, the reality is that there's just not the economic infrastructure out there for people to be able to make a living playing. So people are going to have to, I mean, it's the 21st century, you know, people are figuring out ways to own their own music and produce their own music, and lots of imaginative stuff going on with that. And so we just have to hope that somebody figures out, you know, what's bottom line is I think the people who have the initiative, besides the musicianship, but the initiative to figure out how to create music and to create opportunities for that music to get out into the world for themselves are going to be the ones you're going to hear about. More and more owners are owning their own recordings and taking steps to do that. And so we can just hope that that's a trend that continues and that somebody's going to figure out a way to keep this circuit going so people can continue to play. But you know, it isn't just a problem, not just a homegrown problem anymore. I mean, you know, the surplus of trained musicians. It's a worldwide problem because there are all these music schools all over the world now. You can go anywhere in the world now and find people. I was in China, man. You should have heard some of these guys I heard in Beijing. I heard this Italian piano player in Beijing, and he sounded like, you know, McCoy or Bud Powell or somebody. He was brilliant. Yeah. I said, what are you doing in Beijing? He said, well, I can work here. You know, and he had a good band. They sounded great. Moreno Donadel.
Wow.
And he spoke fluent Mandarin, too. I spoke to him in Italian because I didn't speak Chinese well enough to talk to him. But, man, this guy could really play. And there are a lot of people like that over there. Some of them have trained here and gone back.
I mean, the world has really become a globalized place.
Yes, it really has. So somebody, you know, we're in a big transitional phase. I don't think people realize it that much, really. But on a day-to-day basis, you're in it. You don't see it. But the way trends are going, this globalization is going to lead to more opportunities. And it's going to lead to more networks. And it is, and already has, led to the demise of traditional record companies. That's not happening anymore.
Sure.
And traditional nightclubs are hard to make viable, so maybe cooperatives are the way to go. I don't know how it happens. You know, I always tell aspiring students who come to visit Williams, you know, you should think carefully about where you go to college and the skills you acquire, because you're probably going to need 2 or 3 careers over the course of your lifetime in this century. It's not going to suffice to just have one specialty or one kind of expertise that you can parlay into a living.
Yeah, yeah. Well, do you have any advice for someone who's considering a pursuit in jazz education?
Well, you got to be a self-starter. You got to be able to organize things. You got to like to organize people. And you got to like to deal with people. You can't be like sort of a person who doesn't have good relationships with other people. And you got to learn to accept other people and learn to assess quickly their limitations, their interpersonal skills, how you can combine them with other people in a way that helps to bring out their best, you know. And that's really more important. The interaction I do with individual students and colleagues and people, I would say, is ultimately more important than the technical stuff that you teach in a class, because everybody knows what that is, right?
Yeah.
But the ability to sort of assess where a particular student's at and what their strengths are and what they need to work on and who you can put them with so they'll have a good experience and want to keep playing and learn from it, that's something that you really can only develop with experience. I think experience is the greatest teacher. I think that's the summary of my philosophy. And I certainly wish I had had the experience that I have now when I started teaching, because I would have been a much better teacher at that time. But that's the way it is with anything.
That's the way it is. Yeah.
It's the way it is. You've got to hang in there,
yeah.
And longevity will enable you to have enough experience to be effective. But no book on how to teach is going to teach you how to teach any more than any book on theory is going to enable you to write a good tune. You know, you got to have experience. You got to know what it's like. You got to put yourself in those situations where you have to do stuff. I was lucky, like with UMass and Max and those guys, and at the beginning in Williams too. I just got thrown in. It's like, here, you got to teach a course on jazz harmony. Well, how do I do that? Well, we don't know. Usually it's your job.
Just
you
learn it.
You know, okay, and then you figure it out, and you got to have the courage to fail, like anything else.
Well, just before I finish up, for people watching, could you tell us a little bit about your son Marty Jaffe, a phenomenal young bassist? He's just been nominated to be a presidential scholar. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Well, I'm going to tell you about all my kids, because I can't tell you about Marty without telling you. It's just like if you ask me a question in my Duke Ellington class.
Sure,
Tell us
sure.
about Too Good to Title from Second Sacred Concert. Well, you know, we can't start there. We have to start with West End Blues and Creole Love Call, because that's where those techniques came from. But no, seriously, Marty's the youngest of three really talented musicians. And Ciora is a flute player. She is his older sister. She lives in Jamaica Plain, and she went to Cleveland Institute. She plays piccolo and flute. She's phenomenal. So when he was a little tyke, he was hearing her practice and all that. And Lysander, his brother, is in Durham University, and he's into violin and viola, Georgian folk music, Ukrainian folk music, singing. He's been there to do that, to Georgia. And he plays in a Bulgarian dance band.
Wow,
And he plays
great.
jazz
Yeah,
also.
yeah.
And he's into ethnomusicology and is fluent in Russian.
Yeah.
So Marty's heard, between that and what I do, he's heard and tagging along to gigs when he was a little kid. You know, I used to bring him to Jazz in July when I taught in the summer, and Sheila Jordan would, you know, thought he was the cutest little thing, and then a few years later she heard him play and she wasn't surprised, you know. So he's just had music. Like, at one point, one of my colleagues at Williams, Ileana Perez Velasquez, she has a young son, and she said, I want my son to turn out like Marty did. Can you ask him to make a list of the things he listened to when he was Oliver's age, right? So Marty couldn't remember. And I helped him remember, oh yeah, you listen to Mingus every night, and you listen to this and that, whatever it is. So that's the most important thing. So because of all this listening that he did, which was sometimes sort of forced on him environmentally and sometimes proactive, he just became a great bass player. And he's a great piano player too. And he's self-taught at that. And he's written some fantastic tunes, and you know, he's studying classically now too, and I'm sure that he'll be able to, you know, you come back in 10 years and you'll be interviewing him, because he'll be like one of the best known bass players on the planet.
Check him out on the scene.
Yeah, you know, we're waiting to decide, to hear from various colleges. He's got auditions at, you know, Juilliard and NYU and Oberlin and NEC so far. I don't know if I'm forgetting any. But he also applied to Michigan, so we'll see where he winds up. And then where it goes from there. But you know how bass players are. I don't have to tell you. Bass players have that supportive affect, right?
Yeah.
They understand their role within the ensemble is to be the glue and hold things together and support people and provide the pulse and not be too egotistical and really make things happen and assess the situation instantly. Like I was talking about teaching, evaluating student levels and stuff. Same thing with a bass player. You can tell a good bass player, they know their job is within the first couple of minutes to figure out how they're going to gel with these other people and support them. And he's got that going on. That's the most important thing.
Good. Yeah.
For a while, and you know, there was this period in jazz where the bass players were trying to be really, not that there's anything wrong with being virtuosic, but trying to be stars in terms of soloing and things like that. And it doesn't necessarily enhance your role within the ensemble to do that. It's good if you can do it, but you can't expect to solo all the time. That's not your important role. Yeah, and he knows that. And he's had that inculcated in his consciousness since he started taking this seriously.
Well, Andy, thanks a lot. Where can people check out your music?
Oh, they can go to, thank you, Jonah, they can go to andyjaffe.com, and there are PayPal links there if they want to buy any CDs or fake books or books, and there's music posted there, and there are embedded YouTubes there, so they can actually go to here. YouTube, they can see performances of Bill's and my big band. They can go to the MP3 links and hear things that are on the CDs they might want to buy. And, you know, come to gigs.
Excellent.
So,
well, thanks a lot, Andy.
Thanks
for giving us a good insight.
It's an honor. Thanks.
Be dooby dooby